Hello students, teachers, parents, history nerds. Hello everybody, and welcome to Nutshelled History, where we lay out the facts, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Today we are going to continue our United States history series by looking at post-war America. Don't forget that there's a link for a fill-in-the-blanks worksheet in the description. I just ask that you like and subscribe. I apologize for any mispronunciations ahead of time. I do my best. Okay, let's go. The beginning of the Cold War. Picture this. It's February 1945, and three of history's heavyweight leaders, Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill, have gathered in Yalta. It was like the ultimate summit of frenemies, where everyone was technically on the same side, but secretly taking mental notes for their post-war grudges. Everyone knew the Allies would soon crush Germany, but what came next? Well, that's where things got interesting. The United States and Great Britain had big dreams of a united, free Germany and independent nations in Eastern Europe. Stalin, however, wanted a weaker approach, a divided Germany and an Eastern Europe tucked snugly under Soviet control. Despite smiling and making vague promises at the conference, Stalin went ahead and claimed Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria as Soviet BFFs, aka satellite states, while also staking a claim on East Germany. Fast forward to the summer of 1945, and there's a new face at the conference table, President Harry S. Truman. At Potsdam, Truman quickly got the vibe that Stalin wasn't just dreaming small, he was aiming for world domination. As a result, the 46-year Cold War began, an era of icy side-eye across the globe. A few years later, Churchill delivered his famous Iron Curtain line, noting that Stalin was drawing a thick line of communism down the center of Europe. Stalin, meanwhile, was busy spreading communism like it was a new fashion trend. To fight back, Truman asked Congress for funds to help Greece and Turkey keep communism out. This promise of aid was dubbed the Truman Doctrine, marking a new phase of U.S. foreign policy: keep the commies out. Then came the Marshall Plan, another bold idea to contain communism. Secretary of State George C. Marshall proposed that America help Europe rebuild its economy. Cool $13 billion in grants and loans, to be exact. It wasn't just kindness, it was a calculated move to keep Western Europe from falling under the Red Spell. In 1948, Stalin decided to pull a stunt, blocking all routes into West Berlin to starve the city into submission. But the US and Britain weren't about to let him win. They launched the Berlin Airlift, an epic food and supplies delivery operation that made Stalin's blockade look like a failed reality TV plot. This defiance showed that communism could indeed be contained. To solidify the anti-Soviet stance, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, was born in 1949. 12 Western nations formed a super squad to defend Western Europe against the Red Menace. And predictably, Stalin had his own countermove. In 1955, he rounded up his Eastern European squad, minus Yugoslavia, the lone wolf, and formed the Warsaw Pact, a backup plan in case things got messy. Thus, the stage was set for decades of Cold War drama. The Korean War, ever since the Russian Revolution, the Soviets had been on a mission to spread communism like it was the next big thing. For years, they waited for communism to take over the world, sure it was just around the corner. Then in 1949, China practically said, "Hold my tea," and it looked like the Soviets' dreams were finally coming true. Chinese nationalist leader Jiang Jiechi, also known as Chiang Kai-shek in the States, and communist leader Mao Zedong had once been BFFs against Japan in World War II. But as soon as the dust settled, it was a classic case of, "It's not me, it's you." They became fierce enemies. The US backed Jiang, while the Soviet Union slipped some support to Mao. By the end of 1949, Mao's communists had taken control of mainland China and set up the People's Republic of China. Score one for Team Red. Then communism's next chapter moved to Korea. After World War II, Korea was split along the 38th parallel, with the US and the Soviets each setting up shop on their respective halves. On June 25, 1950, about 90,000 North Korean troops, armed to the teeth with Soviet weapons, stormed across the border into South Korea. Cue President Truman, who sent American troops to help out South Korea alongside United Nations forces. In came the legendary General Douglas MacArthur, who promptly pulled off a surprise landing at the port city of Incheon in September 1950. By October, the North Koreans were hightailing it back across the border. But Truman had a bad feeling about pushing too far north, worrying China might join in. MacArthur shrugged it off, assuring him, "Nah, China won't get involved." Then, on November 26, 1950, just to prove MacArthur spectacularly wrong, 300,000 Chinese soldiers crossed the border and attacked. Truman, not eager to start a full-scale war that might involve nukes, tried to keep the fight limited. But MacArthur, seeing things a bit differently, wrote a letter to Congress that threw shade on Truman's strategy. That was the last straw for Truman, who handed MacArthur his walking papers. By spring 1951, the Korean War had reached a frustrating stalemate. In 1953, President Dwight D. Eisenhower subtly hinted he was open to using nuclear weapons to bring about a ceasefire. Finally, both sides agreed to stop the fighting. So who won the Korean War? In short, nobody. The two Koreas are still divided to this day. But two things did come out of the conflict. The power of the American presidency grew as Truman wielded his military authority, and a new alliance was formed in Southeast Asia. Enter SEATO, the Asian NATO, ready to contain communism in its own corner of the world. The Cold War intensifies. September 2nd, 1949, America got some seriously unwelcome news. The Soviets had their own atomic bomb. Then, as if things weren't tense enough, communists took over China the next month. For Americans, the world was starting to feel like a game of whose bomb is it anyway? President Truman's response? Go big or go home. He ordered the development of an even bigger bomb, the hydrogen bomb. Scientists tried to warn him that this could kick off a never-ending arms race, but the race was already on. For the next 40 years, the US and the Soviet Union kept building up their nuclear arsenals, both relying on the charming philosophy of mutually assured destruction, aka, if you bomb us, we bomb you, and nobody wins. President Dwight D. Eisenhower doubled down on the bomb collection. His policy, called massive retaliation, essentially meant that if the Soviets stepped out of line, the US would respond with enough firepower to make a grand finale out of it. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles added a dramatic flair, insisting the best way to keep communists in check was through brinkmanship, getting this close to war to scare the other side off. On the Soviet side, Nikita Khrushchev took over in 1953 and had big plans to keep spreading communism. When workers in Poland rioted in 1956, he let them win some concessions. But in Hungary, when students and workers had the same idea, Khrushchev shut it down hard. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser wanted to build a dam on the Nile. He figured he'd get support from anyone willing to write a check, so he reached out to both the US and the Soviet Union. The US, not loving his ties with the communists, pulled its funding, which prompted Nasser to take matters into his own hands by nationalizing the Suez Canal. This set off a chain reaction. Britain, France, and Israel invaded Egypt, hoping to keep the canal under their control. But Eisenhower, not thrilled with this plan, refused to back them up, and they quickly backed down. After that, Eisenhower made his stance crystal clear. He announced the Eisenhower Doctrine, promising US military help to any nation feeling the chill of communism creeping in. In 1958, this doctrine got a test run in Lebanon, where US troops helped prop up a pro-American government. Eisenhower and his administration even gave the CIA a starring role in securing friendly governments in Iran and Guatemala. In the Cold War, espionage was just as important as diplomacy, or as the CIA might put it, we're just here to help, covertly. Cold War fears at home. In 1947, the Red Scare swept through America, sparking fears that communists were lurking in every corner, ready to overthrow democracy one sneaky step at a time. President Truman, not one to let a scare go to waste, launched investigations into federal employees. The result? About 3,000 people either got booted out or took the hint and resigned before they could be kicked to the curb. The Truman administration even dusted off the old 1940 Smith Act, a law against advocating for government overthrow, to send 11 Communist Party members straight to the slammer. Meanwhile, the House Committee on Un-American Activities, HUAC, was busy rooting out subversive activities from every nook and cranny of American life. Colleges, labor unions, city halls, you name it. In 1947, HUAC set its sights on Hollywood, targeting a group known as the Hollywood 10, made up of writers, directors, and producers with some left-leaning ideas. When they refused to testify, HUAC didn't exactly applaud their dedication to the Fifth Amendment. Instead, they were tossed into prison. Hollywood execs then created a blacklist, tanking the careers of anyone even remotely suspected of having communist connections. Adding fuel to the fire were two high-profile spy cases. First up was Alger Hiss, a government official who'd helped organize the United Nations. In 1948, Whittaker Chambers, a former Communist Party member turned whistleblower, fingered Hiss as one of his espionage buddies. Hiss denied everything, but a skeptical HUAC wasn't buying it, and he ended up with a 5-year prison sentence. Then there were Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, accused of passing nuclear secrets to the Soviets. They claimed they were being targeted for their beliefs and heritage, but in a high-stakes trial that had the nation glued to the drama, they were convicted and executed in 1953. And then came Joseph R. McCarthy, the Wisconsin senator who turned up the paranoia to 11. McCarthy claimed he had a secret list of communists in the State Department, but whenever he was asked to name names, his numbers magically changed with each speech. His popularity, however, soared once the Korean War started in 1950. McCarthyism became the buzzword for his dramatic brand of wild accusations. But McCarthy wasn't satisfied with just terrorizing the political scene. By 1954, he had the army in his crosshairs. When his over-the-top bullying tactics were broadcast on TV, viewers saw him for who he was, and his support crumbled faster than a stale cookie. With the end of the Korean War in 1953 and McCarthy's downfall in 1954, the Red Scare's grip on the nation finally began to loosen. Post-war prosperity. When World War II wrapped up, the U.S. stopped churning out tanks and planes, and millions of Americans found themselves asking, so, what now? Initially, many lost their jobs, but soon enough, the nation launched into the longest economic growth spurt in American history. President Harry Truman knew he had to bring the troops home, so he kicked off demobilization, aka sending soldiers back to civilian life. To help everyone ease back into normal life and calm fears of a job shortage, the government rolled out the GI Bill of Rights. This law had all the perks: unemployment benefits, college tuition help, and even loans to start a business, so veterans could trade in their fatigues for, well, whatever they wanted. Of course, the returning soldiers had more than just jobs on their minds. Cue the baby boom. In 1957, a record 4.3 million babies were born, kicking off a nationwide population expansion pack. Between 1940 and 1955, the U.S. population shot up by 27%. This baby frenzy, combined with a craving for consumer goods, sent prices and inflation through the roof. Meanwhile, the Sun Belt, states in the South and West with warm weather and loads of job openings in defense, aerospace, and electronics, suddenly became all the rage. As people moved south and west, political power followed. Suddenly, suburbs and sunny states were calling the shots, while the once mighty Northeast and Midwest saw their influence dip. The economy was also changing shape, with manufacturing and farming taking a back seat. Jobs in services, information, and retail were booming. Franchises like McDonald's and Holiday Inn popped up everywhere, while multinational corporations took off, exporting everything from sodas to sitcoms around the globe. Unions had their own shakeup. In 1955, the AFL and CIO joined forces to become the AFL-CIO, boosting their political muscle. However, many of the shiny new white-collar office workers weren't interested in joining unions. And with inflation squeezing wallets, unions that did exist weren't shy about demanding pay raises. When employers said no, workers went on strike, and Congress passed the Taft-Hartley Act, which made it illegal for workplaces to hire only union members. Truman didn't let this post-war era go by without pushing his own vision. He introduced the Fair Deal, aiming to expand on the New Deal with goodies like national health insurance. But Congress pretty much ghosted him on that one, and most of his proposals never got off the ground. In 1952, the reins were handed over to Dwight Ike Eisenhower, who won the presidency in a landslide. Ike's biggest hits included creating an interstate highway system and funding education, all while keeping a steady hand on America's now booming economy. Mass culture in the 1950s. Between 1940 and 1960, more than 40 million Americans packed up their bags, waved goodbye to city life, and flocked to the suburbs in one of the greatest migrations ever. Housing developers pounced, building affordable homes faster than you could say, picket fence. The government even sweetened the deal with low-interest loans, making the dream of homeownership more achievable than ever. The whole suburban boom, though, would have gone nowhere without the Interstate Highway Act of 1956. Congress greenlit funds for 41,000 miles of highway, a massive road system designed to zip commuters from their suburban nests to the big city and back again. Not only did the new highways shorten commutes, but they also sent the travel and vacation industries into overdrive. Road trip, anyone? Meanwhile, the post-war economy was on fire and Americans were cashing in on the consumer craze. Shopping became the national pastime, with folks buying on credit like there was no tomorrow. Median family income, the average family's pay, soared, and with easy credit and a wave of new gadgets to buy, retail therapy became an all-American ritual. The perfect family of the 1950s, according to popular magazines, was a setup where dad brought home the bacon and mom stayed home to tend to the house and kids. But by the end of the decade, some women began questioning the whole stay-at-home routine, challenging the idea that a woman's place was in the kitchen. The idea of family life also became all about the kids, thanks in part to Dr. Benjamin Spock, whose best-selling books convinced parents that nurturing children, all the way from diapers to diplomas, was top priority. Television also took America by storm, shaping young minds with sitcoms that showcased the ideal family, where everyone had a smile, a snappy one-liner, and zero real-life problems. TV became the national culture machine, flattening out regional quirks and creating one big, happy, primetime-ready American identity. Educational opportunities expanded too. By the early 1960s, almost 40% of college-age Americans were hitting the books, up from 15% in 1940. The government poured funds into education, hoping to crank out more scientists and science teachers. States boosted their public universities, while California rolled out a master plan to make college accessible to everyone, offering 3 levels of education: research universities, state colleges, and community colleges. The result? More Americans could afford to dream big, now with a degree to back it up. Social issues of the 1950s. Despite the booming 1950s, not everyone was feeling the vibe. While some Americans were busy collecting new cars and matching furniture, social critics and a crew of offbeat writers and artists known as beatniks were rolling their eyes at all the materialism and cookie-cutter conformity of suburbia. Alienation, feeling like you're the odd sock in the drawer, became a major theme in popular novels of the day. And then there was rock and roll. If television was the glue of the family, rock and roll was the thing pulling teens away from the dinner table. Born from the rhythm and blues of African-American musicians, rock music exploded when Elvis Presley threw in gospel tunes and hip-shaking moves that left parents clutching their pearls. Complaints poured in, but rock music was unstoppable, becoming a badge of youth rebellion and the new power of teen culture. But beneath the prosperity were urban slums, struggling farms, and deep-rooted discrimination. Michael Harrington's book, The Other America, 1962, delivered a sobering message. Around 50 million Americans, about a quarter of the country, were living in poverty, out of sight and largely out of mind. The invisible poor included inner-city African Americans, rural whites, and migrant farm workers in Hispanic barrios. As middle-class Americans ditched the cities for the suburbs, cities lost funding and clout, leaving urban areas strapped for resources. Minorities poured into cities seeking better jobs, but with services on the decline, crime rates rose, giving middle-class families yet another reason to hit the road. The government tried to stem the tide with urban renewal projects, which often ended up pushing people out of their homes and into even more cramped spaces. Rural areas weren't faring much better. Small farmers faced a David and Goliath situation as giant agribusinesses gobbled up the market, leaving family farms struggling to survive. Many rural poor had no choice but to migrate to the cities, hoping for better fortunes. Meanwhile, the fight for civil rights was heating up as efforts to tackle housing and job discrimination took center stage. Latinos and Native Americans were also wrestling with similar struggles. In 1953, the government enacted the termination policy, which sought to dismantle tribal governance and move Native Americans into cities. Proponents claimed it would help Native Americans fit in with mainstream America, but the policy left many feeling further removed from their roots and facing tough adjustments in city life. Okay, let's try to bring the mood back with a little recap. In February 1945, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met at the Yalta Conference for an uneasy collaboration on Germany's post-war future, envisioning peace, yet secretly setting the stage for Cold War tensions. The US and UK favored a united Germany, while Stalin, who wanted to dominate Eastern Europe, made vague promises he didn't keep, claiming satellite states across the region. By summer 1945 at Potsdam, Truman and Stalin's rivalry intensified, igniting a 46-year Cold War. In response to Soviet expansion, the US launched the Truman Doctrine, pledged economic aid through the Marshall Plan, and backed up its stance with NATO. The Korean War only escalated tensions when North Korea, backed by the Soviets, invaded South Korea, leading to UN-backed US involvement until a 1953 stalemate. Meanwhile, the US pushed back on the Red Scare at home, even blacklisting Hollywood figures accused of communist ties, while Eisenhower's policies cemented the US stance against Soviet threats in the Middle East and beyond. Yet amid the booming 1950s, some Americans felt alienated by mass consumerism, with the beatniks pushing back against suburban norms. Meanwhile, Elvis and rock and roll captivated rebellious youth. Hidden poverty, rural struggles, and discrimination persisted beneath the surface, as cities strained under urban decay and rural areas faced agribusiness dominance. The civil rights fight grew as Native Americans and Latinos joined the push against discrimination in a complex, shifting American landscape. There you have it, folks. That is post-war America nutshelled. Thanks for stopping by Nutshelled History. Now go post-war boom boom on those like and subscribe buttons for me, please. Do you prefer 50s cars or 60s cars? Let us know in the comments down below. See y'all next time on Nutshelled History.